This conference will now be recorded.
So once again, I welcome everybody for joining us this evening, and most importantly, we thank Professor Johnson for agreeing to share his experiences with us, his knowledge with us. Our community has a dwindling number. We were graced to have an Izzy Nissenbaum and to have an Irvine Gelman and to have others who had firsthand experience of events that Kristallnacht began and led into. And we are very, very fortunate and blessed to have Professor Johnson with us as a member of our community who just celebrated, it was your 90th that we had the drive-by for. Is that correct, Professor?
94.
94th, excuse me. So we had a drive-by for the professor's 94th birthday a number of months ago. And like I put in the email, Professor Johnson is someone who experienced this firsthand. And we have the privilege of hearing him share with us his experience and also his reflections and his thoughts with that basis and that perspective of history that he experienced and has, looking forward at the Jewish people and at the world today. So we thank Professor very much for taking the time to share with us. And the format is that we will all be muted, myself included, and the professor will speak for about between 30 and 40 minutes. And afterwards is when everyone will have a chance to ask any questions and engage with the professor. So once again, Professor Johnson, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us these experiences, of course, on this night, the anniversary of Kristallnacht that the professor experienced. So once again, thank you very much. And I now mute myself and hand the mic over to the professor.
Thank you. Well, with a wonderful introduction like this, I can hardly wait to hear myself talk. Now I've got, first of all, good evening, Rabbi. Good evening, fellow congregants. I'm sharing with you my personal experience, and I'm going to take you back to the year of 1938, 72 years ago. I was 12 years old at the time, and I have very vivid recollections. I'm very lucky that I have a good visual memory. So I'm going to tell you what it was like for me on November the 9th. I came home in the afternoon from Hebrew school. It was sort of uneventful, go to bed, and then I'll describe a little bit our house. We lived in Bremen, Germany. There were not many Jews there, maybe about 1,200 to 1,500 Jews. I don't know whether 2,000 would be max. There was only one synagogue, and it was Orthodox, just like our synagogue here. I didn't know of anything else, by the way. We were brought up Orthodox from the beginning, and there was no alternative. I mean, I didn't know even an alternative existed. Now, in order to survive, you need a lot of mazel. And one of the mazeldik things was that my parents weren't home. My parents were driving to Breslau. My mother wanted to visit. We knew 38 was already a time to get out. The year was already very tense. Most of our family already had left. We were one of the few last remaining of our immediate family who was still in Germany. They had left to Brazil, to Argentina, to America, all over the place, but we were the last. My father had to hang on. Our business was sold at the beginning of 1938. It was a substantial business. I'm surprising that the Germans allowed the business to remain, because in 1933, when they came to power, they closed most of the Jewish business. And now, of course, I realize why they let us remain, because my grandfather started a recycling business. It was typical Jewish. You had to recycle in order to survive. There weren't many alternatives, but he built it up into a very substantial business. And my father and his brother were the partners, and they built it up. We were, I think, pretty well to do. I didn't know this, but thinking back, I can give you some of the numbers. We had a private car, private chauffeur. Of course, we had a Jewish maid, so there was no shiksas there. I mean, we always had Jewish maids who were educated, and they lived with us. We had a 3-story house, 149 Lange Markstraße. The house still exists. I went back there twice to see it. Now, coming back to 1938, I went to bed at about 12:30 at night. I woke up, I heard a loud noise, a lot of banging around. I opened the door. Outside my door, our bedrooms were on the 3rd floor. And the bedrooms consisted of, I had my own bedroom, then there was my sister next, and then my grandmother was babysitting us. She was in the bedroom that my parents used to have. So that was the 3rd floor. And then there was the bathroom on the floor. And so I saw a Nazi standing there with a gun in his hand. Happily, he didn't shoot us, but the Nazis did shoot 6 of Jews in our town that particular night. One of them actually was, the one woman they shot was the mother of our babysitters, another people we know. He still had the bullet that killed his mother. Anyway, this was my first vision of how did they get here? Well, our maid must have opened the door to them, and there were about a dozen of them, and they were making an enormous amount of noise because they broke all the glass they could put their hands on. They toppled over cupboards with glass in it. We had a huge grandfather clock. They knocked that over. My mother was a pianist and singer, and she had a grand piano. They took out a knife and ripped off some of the strands with their hand, I think, but it must have been a knife because they damaged it. And then the chairs, they took chairs and broke the legs off. I mean, they did as much damage as they could. However, just by miracle, there was one room they didn't touch. There was one room, which in Germany called the Herrenzimmer, just for men, where the men used to retreat and smoke. And that room had our Sefer Torah. That room with the Sefer Torah was untouched, just by miracle, which is kind of interesting. So then they left, and they came back 3 times during the night asking for my father. Just by sheer muzzle, my father wasn't home. We found out later on, people that night, all the men were taken to the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen. And my father was on a list to be shot. We found that out from one of the survivors because the Germans let some of the prisoners out if they could show they wanted to immigrate. And they came to our house and they told us, hey, there was a list with your dad's name on it, and he would have been dead. I wouldn't be talking to you today if that would have happened because there was no way we could have come out. We had a little bit of a problem with the immigration anyway because my mother was born in Poland. She had sort of Polish paperwork, which made it very difficult to get to the United States. The Polish quota was very, very limited. And the German quota was also very limited because they didn't want Jews. All right, now the next day, my grandmother sent me back to school, go back to school. I went to school as soon as I got there. There was a message, I had to go to see the principal. And the principal of the high school said, no, you can't stay here, we have to disenroll you. And they gave me some report card, said, yeah, you may want to use this. I never used it. And so that was the end of schooling. Then when I got back home, my grandmother and I walked to where the synagogue was, and we saw the synagogue still smoldering. The inside was completely burned out. The synagogue was at Gartenstrasse 6. I remember it very, very well. I can sketch it in great detail. And the door was open, and the Torah scroll was being rolled out to the front door. And part of it was on the street. There was still water in the street since the firemen put out the inside of the synagogue. The synagogue was built in 1875. It lasted, not too long, I'm afraid. And it was a beautiful structure. The women were upstairs, the men were downstairs. This was typical of the European synagogues. And then next to the synagogue was a building they didn't touch, which had the schoolroom where the Hebrew schools were, and the teachers teaching went on. So that was the experience, and then you come home. And then a couple of days later, what happened now to my parents? My parents got stranded in Berlin. It turned out my father was kind of Jewish looking. So they just, as he was walking in the street, he was kind of brave walking around the streets, which he shouldn't have done. By the way, we still had a car. He drove to Berlin after Kristallnacht. Jews were no longer to have a car. Restrictions came, tighter and tighter. So you were really already outcast there. But he still had the car in Berlin. And he was visiting, some of the Germans caught him there and beat him up. So he did get damaged. And he had permanent damage in his face as a result of being beaten up, but he survived. Then he called up his mother, or my grandmother, and my grandmother gave him an interesting message, which only you would be able to interpret. And I give it to you in the original form. Said, "Geh nicht aus Sholom." Don't go aus Sholom. Did you understand what that meant? Aus Sholom, when he said Shmona Esrei at the end, you go backwards, right? He understood it. Don't come home. She didn't want him to come home. And sure enough, he stayed away for a couple of more weeks. Interestingly, my parents in Berlin contacted the people that had bought our business, and they were not anti-Semites, which is they were aristocrats, Prussian aristocrats, quite well-to-do, and they invited my parents to stay with them, and they were hiding there for 2 weeks, staying with the people that bought our business. Very nice people. I have pictures of them. I met them. And after 2 weeks, they told my parents, "I'm afraid you have to leave because General von Keitel is coming to visit to go hunting to them." It gives you an idea what kind of circles these people were in General von Keitel. So my parents had to leave and they came back home. So happily, the Germans, sort of forget about getting my father then. At least we had a little bit of respite. And now the next problem was, where are you going to go? All borders, where would you go? There was no place that would accept us. There was no way to get a visa anywhere. This was a very desperate situation. We were lucky that we knew about the Cuban visas that were being sold by a man from the Cuban embassy, and it turned out to be a fraudulent visa. Happily, we didn't buy into it. Did you know what happened to these people who did buy? There were 936 German Jews traveling on a ship called the San Luis to Cuba. Now, Cuba didn't accept these fraudulent visas, so the ship then was full of Jews, German Jews, who tried to get to Cuba, and Cuba wouldn't receive them. The captain on the ship was very sympathetic to the Jews, and he very slowly first went to Miami. They weren't allowed to leave the ship in Miami, and then he very slowly drove along the coast. And the people on the ship begged the State Department with telegrams and the president, "Please take us in." They refused. Something to keep in mind. Roosevelt was very popular with Jews in New York. He was a big anti-Semite. Not a single Jew was allowed to leave the ship. In fact, he had a special Coast Guard following the ship to make sure that not a single Jew would escape. How do you like that? I mean, and now these were doomed for death. I mean, they had to go back to Europe. Some of the countries took some of them in. In the end, the Germans killed 900, of the 937, 254 were later on killed by the Germans. Some of them did escape to other countries. And now getting out, if you escape, for instance, to Holland, France, or Belgium, the Germans occupied those countries and they would get you anyway. So happily, we didn't end up there. So how did we get out? It was a very desperate situation. Nobody wanted us. And I remember very vividly, how are you going to survive? All of a sudden, there was no more kashrut. I don't know how my parents managed to the food. I don't remember how they did it. They didn't tell us how they did it, how they survived. I mean, all of a sudden, things got very, very dicey. They were already pretty bad since Hitler came to power, but somehow the Jews seemed to think, well, they won't last. They couldn't last. After all, this was a civilized country. How can they do this to us? And then one of the things that my grandmother did, and I hope I didn't mention this earlier. If I did, I'd better repeat it. My grandmother was very courageous. As one of the Nazis came up the stairs, we were on the third floor, and he was taking off all the pictures on the landing and breaking them. And my grandmother had a lot of courage. She asked this Nazi guy, "How can you do this to us? My son was in the First World War. My father was in the military. In fact, all my uncles were." He didn't answer. And this is what bothered me for a long time. How can you do this to loyal citizens who were loyal and wanted to be Germans first? They call themselves German citizens with Jewish belief system. This is the official way in which the German Jews describe themselves. Germans first, German citizens with Jewish belief. But the Germans never accepted them. Going to the war didn't make any difference. The Jews were just outsiders. They were never considered equal, even though they participated in the Weimar Republic and they did all kinds of things to get involved, but they had no power, and they really didn't. If you're a minority, you have a hard time. There were 600,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. At the end, there were no Jews left in Germany. Hitler killed about 250,000 were murdered. Some of the others, as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, my mother's brothers, who lived in Breslau, came by our house. I remember it very vividly. They went to England. They transferred a whole factory to London. And they said to my father, "Hey, come with us." My father, "Oh, no, no way. I mean, big mistake. You pay a very heavy price for stupidity." They could have left early. And there was now here, these uncles were the ones who played a very important role in our saving us, because nobody else did anything for us. We tried here, there. Nobody told you anything. We had Jewish employees in our company. We had a Jewish secretary and 2 other Jews who worked there, aside from about a couple of dozen, about 2 dozen non-Jews who worked in the business. But none of the people, even who worked for us, told us how they got out. They were already gone. That's another thing that bothered me. There was not enough information shared, at least as far as I can see, because we were completely in the dark. My mother made the phone call. Happily, the phones were not cut off yet. They allowed us phone call. My mother made a phone call to London to her brothers, and I was next to her when she made the phone call. And she said to them, "If you don't help and save us, you have to sit shiver." They understood this, and then they got motivated, and they were the ones who rescued us. Now, in order to get to England, they had to guarantee that we were not going to be a burden to the state. We were completely at their mercy. They had to support us. That was the condition, the only condition. And one other condition, that we wouldn't stay in England, that we would then move on to America. We had a waiting number. We had a number that we could use in order to transfer to America. That was our main aim. To give you an idea of the anti-Semitism in the State Department then, and it is still there today. It has not changed. My father, I have a copy of the letter he wrote to the State Department. "Could I please get my grandmother had a visa to go to America. They had it, we didn't." And he asked the State Department whether he could use that visa. They said no. I mean, completely heartless. So we were then stuck in England all during the war, but at least we were saved from Germany, and we were lucky that we didn't end up in Holland or Belgium or France, because there we would have been caught anyway. And then England was also on the verge of being invaded by the Nazis, and it was a close call. We were there in London all during the Blitz, and all during the struggle to survive there. It was not easy. It was very difficult to come from, and I think particularly for my father, I didn't sort of feel it as much because as a child, you don't, you're not really privy to all the financial stuff. But I remember exactly how much money we had and where it came from. It was difficult, and slowly in England, my mother was the one who was pretty brave. I have to tell you, this is an incredible woman that I was very fortunate because she saved my father 3 times, including his life. But once in Germany, he jumped into the lake. He couldn't swim. My mother had to rescue him. So there were other times that she played a very critical role. But in England, we did homework and we did all kinds of things to survive. And that was another long story, how we managed to survive there and finally made it to America. We got to America only after the war. Now, coming back to the German experience. Hitler came to power in 1933, and the very first act was against us, against the Jews, the very first thing. By the way, he also first built a concentration camp. The concentration camp was to intimidate people, of course. Once you know a concentration camp exists, you're scared. I mean, so the idea is to frighten people, to terrorize them. That was propaganda. And of course, he built on the anti-Semitism that existed in Germany and all over Europe. Actually, there was more anti-Semitism in Poland than in Germany. My mother remembered as a child, this was 1900, that people used to come, Żyd, Żyd, being called Jew and so forth. Even this was in Poland. It was in German-occupied Poland. It's kind of interesting. My parents both spoke German because the area where my mother came from was Poznan. And Poznan was occupied by the Germans at the time. And so the Jews there spoke Polish, of course. They were fluent in German and, of course, Hebrew and Yiddish. So everybody there knew 4 languages fluently. And then there was a pecking order. Now, another thing to remember is the pecking order. Unfortunately, the German Jews thought they were superior to the Eastern European Jews. I mean, that's a stupidity I don't understand. It turned out to be the other way around. But that, being classified as to understanding, the pecking order is always very delicate. How do you evaluate people? Well, now I want to explain to you a little bit what I gathered from looking around and reading books. For instance, there's a book which has a lot of critical information which I want to share with you. It's called, you see it here? Jewish Life in Germany, which describes in great detail, this was written by a non-Jewish woman who compiled the situation, what it was like for Jews in very great detail. And so I read that, and it sort of reinforced some of the information that I knew personally. Now, I'll tell you what it was like from 1933 on, because I have a vivid recollection. I even remember the last election in Germany in 33. I was 7 years old. I remember the sign, the voting sign on the sign. Hindenburg was the key guy, and Hitler was just a small picture of him on the bottom. He was just the assistant or the vice, second one in charge. But then Hindenburg somehow died very quickly after he got elected, and then Hitler took over. Now, the first thing he did, the very first thing, was these edicts against Jews. The Jews were immediately eliminated from all public services. They had to be eliminated from the universities. No more Jews in the universities or in any public sector. Then the next thing they went after was the business. All big businesses were immediately taken over by them. They had to be forcibly sold. Berlin was the center of where they did this, but it is all over Germany. That was the time to start thinking about getting out. Zionism there was a Zionist organization, and some of the Zionists, the young youth, that did quite well. They were able to get to Israel, but in very limited numbers. Then Jews tried to get re-educated in order to get a new profession. That was done in Hamburg and in Berlin. There were schools that were specially set up. The Jews tried to get all kinds of things going, but in the end, the Gestapo really kept an eye on everything. And I was surprised to find out after the war, they even kept track of what we children were in. I mean, we were also in some kind of a youth organization. They even kept track of this. At one time, every little thing, every little detail, they checked on. At one time, they arrested my mother because they were suspicious that she was a member of some health organization, which wasn't true. So she was taken in by the Gestapo, and they held her overnight. And she was propositioned by the head of the Gestapo. His name was Peichmann, and she was clever enough to talk her way out of it and get home safely. But having spent a night in the Gestapo locked up is not a very pleasant experience. That was my mother's experience, and she didn't betray her sister-in-law. They were after my aunt, and somehow they made a mistake and went after mother. So what they did is they actually came to your house. They searched all the papers to see what they could find. They didn't find anything. And the details of these Germans were just incredible. For instance, in the very end, when we were allowed to take some of our goods out of the country, we had to make a list of all our possessions in triplicate. And would you believe one of the Gestapo guys came to our house and checked each of the items on the list? I mean, how much in trivia I mean, this is control of which you can't imagine what it was like to be under those conditions. And to live under those conditions for these years is an enormous imposition. And Jews somehow went through this, and it is a very traumatic thing. Now, how does this relate to the United States? My reason for being so interested in this is because I see a little bit of similarity. Did you know that Hitler did not specify his great attack against the Jewish people? He called them a race. We were called, can you imagine, listen to the word, the Jewish race is what he was after. In other words, they are on pecking order. The German race is superior to the Jewish race. They are inferior. In fact, the Jews had to be equated to animals, to pigs. And if they ask you, what are you later on, you had to say you were a Jewish pig. This is how low they were able to get away with this. And the reason that they got away with it in Germany, because there was no objection. The anti-Semitism was so great that they knew nobody would bother. And nobody did. I mean, there were very few people who had the courage to stay with us and help. There were exceptions. I mean, we know there were very few. You had the Schindler List, which was the only one that I know of, but you also had a company that kept it secret that they helped Jews. The Leica camera company helped Jews to escape, which is kind of interesting. So the situation then from 1933 on became tenser and tenser. In 1935, it's another edict. In 1937, even a stronger edict. So successively, every 2 years, edicts were issued, which made life for Jews in Germany much more difficult. But the key word here is the race. We were considered a race. And we had to fill out, I remember I still have that piece of paper, I had to fill out a form to show my ancestry up to grandparents. And they wanted to know whether or not both your sets of in other words, if you had 2 Jewish grandparents, you were considered Jewish, a Jewish race. So some of the Jews who converted to Christianity, if they had grandparents that were Jewish, they were killed just as those who were Jewish. It didn't help them. In Warsaw Ghetto was a church consisting of people who had converted. They were killed just like with the rest of the Jews. It did not help them. It's interesting that how they considered us as a race. And that's something you have to keep in mind. We were downgraded to the very lowest possible way. This is the way to do this in order to exterminate the people. You just make them look like they're not even human, they're unhuman, they're below any status. And the fact that they once helped Germany, that they had these large number of German Jews fighting in the First World War. There was a plaque in our synagogue, I have a copy of it, with 24 young Jewish men in Bremen, in the city of Bremen, paid for their lives fighting for Germany. Didn't make any difference. I asked them, did it make any difference? Well, some of them could live a half year longer in Auschwitz. Big deal. It made no difference whatsoever. It wasn't even recognized. And that bothered the hell out of me for many, many years. And I kept asking the Germans this every time I visited. And they finally confirmed the fact that you were never accepted. And that's something that we Jews here in this country should remember. You think you are accepted, I say you and we are accepted. I don't think so. You're tolerated, you belong, you can participate, but in the end, we are still a minority. And it's very easy to pick on us. And the most sad thing I see is some of the people that we helped to become independent, like the blacks, are now turning on us. They want to be the upper guys. You know, it's not Black Lives Matter, it's Black Lives Matter more than the whites. So that's what they're trying to do, I think. And they certainly want to make us look inferior to them, because why would they attack us? Why would they damage some of our synagogues in Los Angeles? Keep an eye on this. This is a very bothersome situation. Here we help people, and then this is the thanks you get. No good turn goes unpunished, you know, the usual saying. I'm very worried about our survival. Now, of course, the worst part, this happened in Germany as well as it's happening here. Although in the end, the Nazis didn't make any difference whether we were liberal, Reconstructionist, or an Orthodox Jew. You were a Jew. To them, you were a racist, a race Jew. You belonged to the wrong race, and therefore you had to be eliminated. In fact, they were so proud when there were no more Jews. They were called, the city is now Judenfrei, free of Jews. This was celebrated. There were cities that celebrated, now we got rid of Jews. I know the story, individual stories of some of those people who survived. I knew the story of Izzy Ussenbaum, who was a member of our temple, and of course Gelman as well. But I also know intimately the story of some of my cousins that survived. I have a cousin that survived Auschwitz, and he survived sent from Theresienstadt. Now the city of Bremen, where I was unfortunately born, I say unfortunately because if I had a choice, I wouldn't have been there. This is the last place in the world that you want to. They now have a synagogue, another synagogue there, and try to reestablish. Most of the Jews in the city now are Russian Jews. German Jews are hardly left. There may be one or two than the last time I saw them. In fact, when I gave a speech in German, it had to be translated into Russian. So that gives you an idea of who now is. And then how do you recognize synagogues in Europe? Police cars in front of each one of them. You look for a police car, you know there might be a synagogue here. Every one of them is in danger. We were in Madrid once in a synagogue. Boy, are they careful to make sure that when you leave, getting in, you have to show papers and certificates. But getting out, they had to make sure that there was nobody else outside when you left. So you're safe just to get out of there. This is in Madrid. All over Europe, you now have the same situation. Jews are at risk. We are endangered species. Keep that in mind. We are not safe. I'm concerned about survival in the long run because wherever we are, just look at how many people were willing to take Jews in. Has it changed? Very little, very little. Look at the United Nations when they vote. Now the anti-Semitism is now shown against Israel. Israel is now the target, and there's a substitute for anti-Semitism. So anytime you see somebody goes anti-Israel, you know right away he's an anti-Semite. I mean, to me, I equate this because that to them is a substitute for going against our people. Yeah, Europe has not changed. I remember visiting in Vienna once, looking for the synagogue there, and I asked somebody there on the street, "Where is it?" "Oh, you are Jewish? Oh boy, that's there." You know, immediately I knew right away. I asked the wrong person. They were very, upset that they knew I was probably Jewish. Miracles. So I mentioned the word miracles. Yes, I think we depend on miracles a great deal to survive. I mean, the war in 48, 49 against these 5 Arab countries, to survive that was definitely a miracle. I'll bring this up because I talked to some of the people who were fighting in the war, and they had the feeling that some of the neshamas from the 6 million people were helping them. Can you imagine? They had the distinct impression that they were being helped by these murdered neshamas that were helping them. Well, I like to remind you of some of the people that did help us that we should never forget. In 1973, the 3 Arab states invaded Israel on Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur War. Do you remember that? Yom Kippur War. Who saved us? Alexander Haig, who worked in the Nixon administration, saw that the Jews need some weapons, and he asked people to come to the United States, had 2 planes ready, and shipped them the anti-tank weapons that helped them stop the Egyptians coming through. Golda Meir was already ready to commit suicide. This is how close it was in 1973. And this one man, took one man like that to save Israel. There were many such instances where I think we depend. When you asked the premier of Israel, Ben Gurion was asked, "Do you believe in miracles?" He said he doesn't believe in miracles. He relies on them. Kind of strange. Ending up with miracles here on my long story about the Kristallnacht. Well, it's a miracle that I survived, that we survived at all. I consider it a miracle that I have a chance to talk to you people. And I really am very lucky to be in the position I am, and I appreciate the opportunity I had that the Rabbi gave me to share these thoughts with you. And I hope I didn't disturb you too much to make you worry, but I think it's reason to be concerned because we are a distinct minority and we are singled out all the time. 50 years ago, 1950. Before 1950, no Jewish home was allowed to be sold in Orange County to Jews. No home was allowed to be sold to Jews before 1950. That's not a long time ago. Just keep some of the statistics in your mind when you consider your future. And I didn't want to scare you. This is not a scary talk. This is a realistic talk to tell you from my heart as somebody who has survived these years and has seen it. I've seen the devil. I've seen what they can do. And it's scary. It's not a very pleasant experience to have gone through this. And I'm very fortunate to be able to share with you. And I think I'll leave it at this and leave it to the rabbi to see whether he wants to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we appreciate your sharing your experiences and the worldview that resulted from what you had gone through. And as I'm always very careful to stay clear of politics, but when it comes to Israel, and when it comes, not the politics in Israel, but when it comes to the security of Israel and the protection of Israel and standing for Israel, exactly. I think all of the experiences make us realize that that's not political and that is just part and parcel of being a Jew. Exactly. And knowing that God, as he said through the miracles, has given us a return to our homeland. And that is our, I don't want to say that's our insurance policy, but certainly we need to do everything we can to ensure the strength and the vitality of Israel. I had a question, Professor, for you, and then everyone else also, please, like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the professor. I imagine that you had neighbors that you were friendly with over the years. The family was friendly with non-Jewish, Jewish, non-Jewish neighbors. And what was their reaction after this Kristallnacht? And how were you received, and how did they react?
Well, I can tell you about one. After they came through and destroyed our house inside, we had one non-Jew. I remember his name. His name was Lemkul. He was an electrician. He came by to see it and said, why did they do this? They should have stolen this stuff instead of destroying it. That was the reaction. Steal it is better than, so stealing from Jews is always very popular. Keep in mind, the Inquisition, for instance, was done not only for religious reasons, but mainly to get their assets. Anytime you eliminate somebody, you get their belongings, and they went after rich people. The Inquisition was still going on in Peru until 1850. 1850, it was still Inquisition. And the whole idea is to steal. Stealing from Jews is always very popular. I mean, some of the Crusaders, when they came through, in the Middle Ages to go to Israel, the first thing they did not only kill Jews, but rob them. And why were Jews, for instance, accepted in Poland? For economic reasons. Why were they accepted in England? For economic reasons, to help them build up the economy. Did you know that Jews were kicked out of England twice? Twice, and then they came back again. And now we have a huge anti-Semitic party in England. You're aware of this, right? You almost made it to get elected there. Anti-Semitism didn't disappear. It is just like a disease, like the COVID disease, that lays low and it comes up every now and then. That's the way you look at it. Now, Israel, to me, is precious. Your rabbi is absolutely on target. I've been in Israel. I spent a whole year there, and that was the best year of my life. Israel is, when you're there, you feel you're really on holy ground. You really know that you are among your own people. Nobody asks you about whether your religion is. You know you're Jewish if you have a yarmulke. By the way, I went to Bar Ilan University for a year. You had to wear a yarmulke. Once my yarmulke was off, I was like, where's your yarmulke? Can you imagine being in a place where they insist that you wear a yarmulke? This is a beautiful experience to spend a year in a Hebrew university, not Hebrew University, at Bar Ilan University, which is Orthodox. This is the yarmulke that I wore all the time. I keep it with me. This is the yarmulke which I had to wear. It's made by the Druze. The Druze somehow made yarmulkes.
Thank you. Anybody else, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. We're not a bashful community over here. Come on.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Rebecca. I teach the 11th grade Shoah class at Tarbut, and I wrote my question in the chat, but I was just curious. We have a couple students here tonight who were looking forward to hearing your story, and I was curious for them, what would be your message to them about the importance of their study and how you think they can use this education moving forward in their life, because it's very special to have some time truly just to study the Shoah and what happened. So I was curious to hear your perspective on that.
You're asking about perspective of study, the Shoah in general, the story that I just told. Yeah, I think it should be shared. I think it should be known. It should be compulsory almost for every Jew to know this one, and then for the non-Jews as well, because it's an interesting example of the cruelty of people when you castigate one group and sort it out for destruction. We're not the only group that ever got this treatment. Other groups, the Armenians, 1.5 million got destroyed by the Turks. You know, there are other groups in Africa that were completely wiped out. There are examples in Asia where 1 million people got killed because somehow they were in a different group. So this is the cruelty of one group against another group for just control, power. For the Nazis, going against the Jews was one way in which you always have to have an enemy. So this was the enemy that made Hitler successful in Germany. Look, we go against this, and therefore you're okay. As long as you're not a Jew, you're okay. As long as you don't belong to this it's inferior race. So putting one group against another group is one trick that is used quite a bit for political reasons and for power. I mean, this is what, can you imagine where Hitler came from? I mean, it's unimaginable that a guy who was a painter and nobody all of a sudden was in charge of a whole country. By the way, the first thing they did when they got to power is burn down the parliament. There's no more election. There was no election after 33. I remember my mother and her maid going to the election in 1933. It was the last time there was an election. I never asked them who they voted for, by the way. I remember vividly that. So democracy is a very, very fragile thing, and it has to be treated with a great deal of respect. Now, in Israel, you're surrounded by enemies that want to take over, that want to destroy Israel. So they live under a continuous threat of people around them. We're at risk. We're at risk. And another 6 million there, 7 million Jews now, and this is half the total of our people in one place. They were one of the reasons that we survived at all is because we are distributed. They never got all of us all at once, happily. But you know, there were, you know, the numbers. I can give you some very quick numbers. Did you know that there were once 1 million people living in Alexandria 2,000 years ago? There were Jews in China, Burma, India, big congregations. There were huge congregations of Jews in Arab countries. There's not a Jew left in any Arab country now. And they were there for thousands of years. Not that they were just there for a couple of years. The last group of Jews who lived in Syria and Aleppo were there for a very long time. I mean, we are talking a few thousand years. They were integrated there, they spoke Arabic, and they somehow were tolerated. Now they're not there anymore. At the very end, things change dramatically. It's incredible where we end up. You can see it locally here. Just watch where the migration goes, just locally in Orange County. I mean, there was a synagogue in Beth Emet, was a conservative synagogue, had a large population of Jews there. They're almost gone. They sold the synagogue to a church. It's gone. If you go to Rome, you see some of the churches that have still Jewish markings on them. They were once synagogues. Where I lived in Brooklyn, we lived right next to a synagogue. There's no longer a synagogue, it's now some church activity. So we're somehow moving around different areas. Our lives are short, keep that in mind. Having a short life means that you don't see the whole picture. I have just the fact that I'm just this old and I remember things from way back gives me a little bit of an overlap. And then you have to read the books to see whatever happened. The Spanish experience to me is also a very important one to keep in mind, because the Jews there were once very, very prosperous, did exceedingly well, and all of a sudden, all you needed is the Ferdinand, some anti-Semites coming up, thinking, hey, let's get them. 1492. When Columbus left, Columbus was probably a secret Jew. We have a problem, and we are very fortunate. By the way, I've got to say this, even though the rabbi is not listening. We're very fortunate as a rabbi like Rabbi Steiner. We are exceedingly fortunate to have him as a rabbi. He's very, very sensitive to this, and he does it.
Thank you, Professor. Next question, please.
Professor Johnson, can you hear me?
Yes. Who is
First of
this?
all, my name is Shmuel Miller, a proud member of the Beth Jacob community.
Oh, you're Rabbi Bennett, right?
I wasn't born a rabbi. Shmuel Miller. First of all, thank you so much for your beautiful words. And Rabbi Senior, thank you so much for providing this platform and this idea, truly inspiring. I just wonder, you have on this call maybe close to one Jew for each year since Kristallnacht, and probably from the ages of 8 to over 80. I'm wondering if you would have to think of one thing that each of us could do, regardless of our age or our level of observance, one thing that each of us can do every day which keeps us aware and connected, what would that be?
Very good question. Very good. What would that be? How would we connect? I think connecting to the synagogue is a good beginning. In other words, belonging to the synagogue and associating with our rabbi, who gives us, the capacity to think things through and somehow. But I think the most important thing that we can do is to educate our children. We have to make sure our children stay Jewish and marry Jewish. Now, this is something I meant to bring up, and I'm glad you asked the question. I'm very concerned about the intermarriage rate. In this country, for the non-observant, is 75%. Did you know that in Germany, it was close to 40% already in 33? But just by intermarriage, you lose in a couple of generations. And by the way, once you have an intermarriage, where one partner isn't Jewish, and it's usually a woman, the woman is in charge of bringing up the children. 1/4 of them don't stay Jewish. Once this happens, you lose very, very quickly. That was the biggest thing we should do. Thank you for asking this. This is what I forgot to mention. The biggest thing we should do is making sure that our children, that the young people know how important it is to keep the faith. Somehow, to whatever they do, to keep in mind who they are and what is. This is the question that they should be asking. Look at the sacrifices that people have made over these thousands of years to stay in this Jewish area. Do you want to, I would ask him, there's one question. Do you want to be the last one in this long chain? This is what we should be asking each of the young people. Do you want to be the last one? It has to be important to them. You have to feel very strongly that you want to marry another Jewish partner and to bring up Jewish children. That to me was number one. This is number one priority. And this is what I think we should learn from this experience. This is the only thing that I think we can do individually without impacting any other areas and other people. We have a chance to marry. By the way, it's sort of counterintuitive. Do you realize that anti-Semitism actually kept us alive for 2,000 years in Europe? Because they wouldn't allow us to, you couldn't integrate. They kept us separate. In fact, the German Jews called it gesunde Risches, healthy anti-Semitism. They knew this was good. And a little bit of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't good for us. I mean, if you lived through it, because the anti-Semitism, you were in ghettos, you were isolated, but it kept us as Jews. How do you like that as an example of counterintuitive? Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. David Winkle, take another question.
No, I just appreciate hearing your voice again, Fred, and wish we were closer. But it's good to hear you.
Oh, that's David. Hi, David.
And I really appreciate you being around. And I wish our community were back together so I could give you a hug.
Same here. I wish I could hug each one of you in the audience.
Hopefully soon. Hopefully soon.
This is the one, I feel this is a very good group that you've assembled here. And that
I think you've assembled them.
Let me ask the group as a whole, how did whatever I told you, how does that affect you now? What sort of impact did it have on people here? This is what I'm interested in. Did you see any?
You want to answer?
I can speak. I mean, I think I think I'm David. First of all, thank you for sharing with us, and thank you, Rabbi, for pulling this together. I think just further reemphasizing along the lines of what you were just speaking about, the importance of Jewish education and passing it on to your children and their children, and the legacy, and to not ever take it for granted. Not that I do, but to part that to your child.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that personally, and I thank you for that. I can't imagine what you described you lived through, and we're all grateful you're here to share with us, and the miracles that you saw in dark times, and saw lighter times beyond. So thank you.
Professor, I found myself wondering if I might be naive, knowing so many non-Jews who I think of as being without a trace of anything anti-Semitic, who I feel I could count on if I needed them. Based on your experience, you were only 7 years old at the time. It might be an unfair question, but do you think it's misguided to feel that the relative safety we would, the reliance we feel we could feel towards non-Jews, say in this community, is misplaced?
Well, one of the questions I asked my wife is this: having gone through this, do we have any non-Jewish friends that we know where we could possibly be hidden in case things got out of control? Ask yourself that. Do you have any friends that you would think you could trust? Because it does happen. There were Jews that were saved by non-Jews. There were 1,500 Jews who were survived in Berlin during the war, secretly. One of them was a cousin of my mother who was a pharmacist, and they needed a doctor once. They asked for a doctor, and the doctor did not betray him. They could have betrayed him. They could have been killed. He did not betray him. So they're isolated good people. I mean, that's for sure. They're not 100%, you always find some good people among them. But those are the ones you have to search out. They're not many, and I think it might behoove us to do this. Go through that exercise. Who among your non-Jewish friends do you think would be willing to risk their own lives to save you? This is the question that you have to ask. I mean, this is where, for instance, Gelman told the story how he survived, and some of the people did manage to find savers, but they were rare, because it's very tempting. The Nazis made it very tempting to turn Jews in. In fact, this is the sad part of all. Did you know that in Berlin there were a whole bunch of Jews who were turning in other Jews to save their own skin? These were traitors. And when they were found, they were shot immediately. There were some that were immediately shot when they discovered after the war, because they were really traitors. They didn't have to do this as well, not compulsory. They thought they would, save their lives by doing this. But this is unheard of. Unfortunately, we have people that turn against our own people. I don't have to name them. You know who they are. They're very vocal. They want to make a name for themselves now here politically. And they're enemies of us. They're our enemies. They talk against Israel. They have no business doing this.
Based on what you've heard from other people who have been through this and your own experience, do you think we would wind up being disappointed in the non-Jews that we know and trust, generally speaking?
Ask you a question again. I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you're trying to find out.
Do you feel, were you and people who went through your experience, were you surprised at the time? Did people disappoint you in terms of them not being more protective, more supportive in a genuine way? Or in other words, would you be surprised
I'm the most disappointed in our own people who didn't help each other. In other words, the Jews are supposed to help each other. This is by definition. I was most disappointed in unfortunately, even relatives who didn't help us, who could have but didn't. This hurt me a lot, and I haven't forgotten that. That included, by the way, my own grandmother, who kept secret that she signed up for a Get to America and didn't tell her other son. In other words, there was a preference for one son to the other son. Unheard of. I mean, this is very difficult to explain how people act, and this is under, completely unnecessary. Now, as far as the non-Jews are concerned, there were some good people there. I remember there were some who I recall. Let me tell you some specific instances that I have vivid recollection, where a man came up to my father and said, "You're okay." No, he pointed to him, "You're okay," but it's the other Jews. When you hear that, you know you're in trouble. Then I remember very specifically, this is in 1938, the summer of 38. This was the very critical time where somebody got hold of my father. It was another Jew who got hold of my father's lapels and a jacket and said, "You are still here? What are you doing here? You're still here?" In other words, he was sort of questioning his not being active in getting out of there. And this is something that I now try to make sense out of. It's my own father felt very comfortable. He enjoyed the luxuries and the good living and didn't try to get out of there. In fact, he had a chance to, when you're well off, it's easy to get out early. You can take your money with you. Not all of it, but a good part of it. Later on, we were allowed only 3% of our possessions. The Germans took 97% of all the assets. To give you an idea how rich we were, I know the numbers. It was 20,000 marks. The 3% was 20,000 marks. So we couldn't have been very poor. But that money disappeared. We never saw a penny of it. From this I could calculate how well off we were. The Germans in the end took everybody's money. They called it, the people that were in the old age homes, they took their money completely. They called it Sparkonto. They just took all their money and their assets directly from the bank. And they ended up mainly in Theresienstadt and they were killed. Interestingly, one of my cousins told me the very cute story. The last transport of Jews from Bremen in 1941 were shipped out to Theresienstadt. That was the only camp where 50 children were allowed to survive. It was done purposely so that when they came, when the inspectors came to see what you're doing here, they could show, "Oh, look, we have children here," and so forth. This was done just for the Red Cross. Now, the Gestapo guy took them personally to the train. And then my cousin in the train said to this man, "Auf Wiedersehen." You know what that means? Auf Wiedersehen in German means to see you again, right? He said, "If you see me again, I will be hanging from a tree." The Nazis knew they were doing something they're not supposed to do. How'd you like that? They knew very well they were doing things that were not kosher. Now, Theresienstadt was the one place where you had a chance to survive. If they didn't, from there, you were sent immediately to Auschwitz. So that was just sort of a transit camp. So if you're lucky enough to hang around there, you did have a chance to survive. Not many did, but some did. That Theresienstadt, Theresen, all the other camps in Poland were death camps, where they work you to death. Very, very meticulously, in fact. Izzy Nussenbaum gave a very vivid description of what it was like to be there. And I read his book, and I also know firsthand from one of my cousins who survived Auschwitz. What you needed to survive at Auschwitz was having some secret diamonds. Small diamonds hidden on you could potentially help you in a very dire situation. You had to have something to trade. If you could trade that for a piece of bread, and one of them did that, this bread was the survival. You don't want to hear the details of Auschwitz. It was just terrible. And shall I share something else with you, which is very frightening? The Jews were killed by gas, whether it's poison gas. You know who invented that poison gas? A Jew. Fritz Haber. This was the Fritz Haber poison gas in the First World War. He made the nerve gas. He was a Jew, but he, not a very good Jew. He converted to Christianity later on, but he was a Jew, born a Jew. And he was the one who invented the nerve gas that was used to kill our brethren. How do you like that? Fritz Haber was his name. You can look it up. Haber, Fritz Haber. He was a well-known chemist. I think he may have gotten a Nobel Prize for. He was very well celebrated in Germany because he saved the Germans in the First World War for having done some chemical inventions that were necessary to win. He knew the ammonia process to make ammonia for gunpowder. This is, you know, when you look at some of the details, it's very strange. Imagine the Jews being killed by a gas that was invented by another Jew. This you never heard of before.
Well, again,
Professor, you had, sorry, go on. Rabbi Senior, go on.
And this you don't want to hear, actually. This is,
Professor, you had asked us what we heard from what you had said, and I just made like 2 notes, which seemed to be scarily timeless. You said some of the patterns were that people were put against each other. You know, people were there to put one group against another, something that we're somewhat experiencing now. And the fact that elections were stopped or otherwise made useless. So it seems that we do need to keep our radar up to make sure that we remain outstanding and, like you had said, remain a people that stays educated and always knows who they are. So thank you once again.
You're welcome. And of course, you realize from my talk that I'm very much support people who support our people. I'm very much interested in support. We as Jews should look for those that support us and support Israel. That's one of the only things that we have a choice on, if it does make any difference. But in the long run, it's, I don't know, our voices are not that, either that many and that profound. We make up a very small percentage of the population. So as a minority, I think our influence are greater than people realize, mainly in other areas. I mean, in academia, we excel because, as you can see, Jews always study. As our rabbi exemplifies this, Jews were always studious, they were multilingual. That's another aspect of our survival and we appreciated women. The contribution by women was paramount in surviving us as Jews. The oldest profession that survived all these thousands of years among the Jewish things were the shmata business, clothing. They were the very earliest, and the clothing industry was in women's hands. Why do we celebrate sheep? You know, on Passover, the Paschal Lamb, because the sheep gave us wool. The wool was spun and made into clothing. And who was running the clothing business? Jewish women, not men. Men were looked after the sheep, but the final thing of making the clothes is always in women's hand. That's something that somehow isn't stressed enough. Our survival depends on many areas, but that's one of them. So education is so important that you bring up, and watching out for the people that support us, that support Israel. That was my number one criteria, is look for people that support us, that support Israel. If we're interested in Judaism. If you're not interested in Judaism, then of course, then, you know, anything goes. But I think the people in this temple are interested. They should be, right? This is our key idea. It's the survival of our people.
Well, thank you again, Professor. And just on those 2 points in terms of Israel and in terms of the Jews being together and taking care of one another, I just want to let everybody know that on Sunday night, November 29th at 8 p.m., we're going to hear from Rabbi David Stav. Rabbi David Stav is the chief rabbi of the city of Shoham, and he's the chairman of the Tzohar organization. Tzohar is an organization that is paving the way for a more ethical, inclusive, and inspiring approach to Zionist Jewish life in Israel. The title of his talk will be The Jewish People and the State of Israel. What does it mean to have a Jewish identity to guarantee the Jewish future of the State of Israel? He's going to be calling in from Israel at about 6 a.m. his time to speak to us. It'll be 8 p.m. for us Sunday night, November 29th. And again, of course, we will send out information and emails about that as we get closer. But that should be a wonderful presentation to hear from Rabbi Stav, to hear about the Tzar organization. And I think it really is a perfect sequel to the points that Professor so graciously made to us tonight, in addition to sharing his own experiences, but the idea of the importance of the strength of Israel and the importance that the cohesiveness of the Jewish people carries for the strength of Israel, the strength of the state of Israel, and therefore an organization like Tzohar, which bridges the gap between the observant and non-observant, and says, let's not label, but let's look at one another as Jewish brothers and sisters, I think is so, so important. It's so, so important.
Yeah,
Once again, Professor, thank you. Thank you for all of your time and insights and knowledge and experiences that you so graciously shared with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Shalom, shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We miss you, Professor Johnson.
Thank you.
You're
We
welcome.
miss you seeing you, miss your
Thank you very
smile, miss your hugs,
Mark,
and hope to see you
I
soon.
miss you too. I really miss all of you. It's this is a very warm congregation, and we have a very wonderful leader here who's taking care of it. I hope we have
And
many.
we miss Fanny too, so send her our love as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yeah.
And that's to you and Fanny as well.
Thank you, Bessa. Thank you. Thank you. This is what makes life worthwhile, knowing that you have friends that say hello to you while you're still alive. In other words, I'd rather have this while I'm alive, not at the chesped. I mean, I like to see all of you now.
We too are very happy to have you. We were at your 94th, the Chen Yirbu, and they should continue, Professor, with good health and strength.
Well, I've got
Thank you.
I've got more things to share with you, but outside this area. So I'm interested in the big picture, in the huge picture of the universe. So that's what I'm getting that published.
Professor is still publishing books on physics.
Yeah, this is astronomy. This is called. I have a publisher, a Jewish publisher, who's going to publish my book. It's now in the works. He liked it, so and it deals with astronomy. If David Room is in the audience, he has my copy of my book. Rabbi, you had a copy of my
I did.
book from a couple of years ago. This is now a sequel, which sees the bigger picture. In other words, I'm now looking at the big, which I think has an impact on your way of looking at the universe as well. Being in your neighborhood under your wing, we all think in a similar manner. Yeah, this is my next stage. So that's what keeps me alive. We should keep a broad picture of what's going on. I mean, not now, but what happened in the past. Somehow, I think we're missing out on this. Not enough people know our past in greater detail. What happened? Why did this happen? Why did, you know, and what did we learn from this? This is what I'm always asking. What have we learned from the Spanish Inquisition experience? What have we learned now from the experience of Russia, the Russian Jews or the Arab Jews? This is much more interesting now when you're looking at what's happening around you, what happened in the past. And that's what I try to do, is to give you perspective. I don't want to continue on the talk, but it's a perspective, the broader perspective that I wanted to share with you. That really was my main intent. And I hope I succeeded in doing that.
Certainly did. Thank you, Professor. You certainly did. Thank you.
You're welcome. Shalom,
Okay.
shalom, everybody.
Shalom,
Shalom.
shalom. Good night, everybody. And please send our best to Fanny, as Mark said, Professor.
Oh, Ken is there. Ken. Okay.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank
Hi.
you.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. We look
And
forward
mazel
to
tov
seeing you
on your
soon.
book. Mazel tov on getting your book produced.
We look forward to reading it.
Same here. Okay. It'll hopefully come out this year.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Later, tov.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Shalom.